Welcome, everyone. This is Galactic Storyteller. I have a guest with me today, Dave Trebas. He is the author of the Lucy Code. If you haven't heard about what that is, you will by the end of this hour. If you haven't watched the video, I'm going to include the link in the description box. Please, as soon as you're done listening to this video, go watch the Lucy Code. How are you, Dave?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. This has been a long time in the making. You live in Malaysia, but you're here in the States for how long?
I'm just here for a couple of weeks.
Okay. On business?
Business and family.
Okay. Well, fantastic. Let's start a little bit with your background and then how you came to research the Lucy Code. So let's jump in with your LDS background when you converted.
So when I was 7, my family joined the church, but I was obviously too young. And my father, that he joined for the free food.
They have great cooks.
Yes. But before I was able to be baptized, my mom sent my dad off to find work in Texas, and she kind of packed the kids up and disappeared. And we moved around a lot. And my dad went to Southern California and became a Scientologist.
Oh, wow.
And my mom kind of bounced from belief system to belief system. She spent a period of time as a Wiccan. We lived in a commune. We were homeless, had all sorts of, experiences and adventures. And it was at one point we were living in the ghettos of Castroville, and some of the ladies that were in the church that lived there took exception, her having a live-in Mexican boyfriend. And we had illegals living in our garage, and they wanted her to be kicked out of the church, which was remarkable because she really hadn't been going to church. so the bishop kind of pulled her into a court of love, and my mom was like super excited. Oh, a court of love! That sounds amazing. So after the interview,
I've been through that. It's not amazing.
No, it's not always an actual court or actual love. But in this case, this was actually a good bishop, and he realized she didn't know anything about the church, and he told the ladies, "Look, you need friendship and fellowship, or I'll yank your recommend." So that was kind of how we got back into the church. And as part of getting back into the church, my mom kind of jumped in line and sinker. So we went from literally having books of occult and witchcraft to all of a sudden Man's Search for Happiness and Talmud and Skousen and all of the Mormon classics. And as part of it too, my mom wanted to have the priesthood in the house, but she wasn't married, and she kicked all of her boyfriends out. And we had the missionaries living with us. And,
oh, wow.
And when I was 11, there was a missionary that baptized me. And a couple of months later, I walked in and found him rolling around with a neighbor girl that I was pretty close to, who was only 12. And the other companion kind of took me out in the backyard and flipped me upside down and twisted my leg and told me not to tell anybody. So I didn't, but the word got out, and the missionaries got transferred, and the mission president told us not to tell anybody, because sometimes things that are true are just not very useful or faith promoting. And eventually, my mom married a singularly bad man who was my stepdad for a while. And part of all of my journey through Mormonism, I never really had, at that point, a lot of respect for the missionaries. And I never wanted to serve them. And I remember that I did like going to church. I did like the other members. I liked a lot of things about church. And it kind of was a surrogate replacement for my father that was never around that much. And I was attending early morning seminary because this was California. And I went into seminary one morning in 78, and everybody was excited, crying. Oh my goodness, the day's finally here. And I was like, what day? What day? What day? It's like, they said, it's the day when black people can have the priesthood. And I'm like, what do you mean they can now have the priesthood? part of our childhood was spent living in Oakland, where I was the minority. I was actually beat up for being white, and I really thought a guiding star of mine was not to be racist. I really had no intention to be racist. And so I went to my bishop and I said, Bishop, is there a chance, perhaps, possibly, that as a group in a church, we're racist? And he reassured me that we were not. Well, we are definitely not racist. This is all from God. It's all sanctioned. It goes all the way up to the highest level. And he gave me a book called Mormonism and the Negro. And it made it very clear that although it might appear that we were racist, we're definitely not really racist. So, and it didn't look like we were racist anymore. So, and when it came time to serve my mission, rather than doing that, I thought I could make my very Mormon mom happy by just marrying the bishop's daughter and kind of, going about setting up a good Mormon life. And that was kind of my foundation.
Okay.
In the church.
All right. So you got married in the temple?
Yeah, I did.
Served your callings and did all that fun jazz, completely devoted.
Well, completely devoted, but also completely irreverent. I mean, they would have the MC Pioneer Day, and I would make polygamy jokes that were not really appreciated by the daughters of the Utah Pioneers. I think one of my jokes was that back in the day, they didn't have square dances; they had polygon dances. Turn your diagonal angle, like that. So that I would never say that nobody would ever mistake me for a overly devout and zealous member.
Okay.
I just didn't really think that much about the doctrine, and I just Chapel Mormon.
Did you know about the doctrine? Because when you're converted, it's not like they put everything on the table. They have their select 6 lessons that lead you into baptism, and then there's the investigative grooming that happens. So when did you find out about the actual doctrine?
Well, part of it, we had a seminary teacher that he really liked miracle of forgiveness, and so he really drilled into it that Bigfoot was Cain, that was.
Yes.
Bigfoot, he's running around, and Bigfoot is Cain.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to some of my friends who were members years later, and they're like, that's crazy talk. That's not true. It's like, wow.
I grew up with that in the 70s.
Exactly. That's Bigfoot is Cain. It was just kind of given. That the earth is only so many thousand years old, and the city of Enoch probably had escalators, just things like that. So, yeah, it's still up there floating. We don't know where, but it's still up there. And just Mormonism in the 70s attracted a lot of people that had a lot of ideas that weren't necessarily correlated.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them that were obviously correlated, which were just a little, insane. So things kind of unrolled. And in 2008, the guy that I had as my accountant, who I'd asked him to help me with some legal problems that I was having. And I said, look, just figure out my finances, whatever they are, make them beyond reproach. And so he knew I was a good guy that was honest. And despite my irreverent behavior, he became the stake president, and he called me as his executive secretary. And I was mortified because I really wasn't one of those people that wanted to be sitting up on the stands. I prefer to sit in the back row and sketch drawings and make faces and just look at the clock and so I found myself at a leadership college in California in 2008.
Wow.
And Prop 8 hit, and one of the things that was difficult for me is that what we were telling the world publicly as a church did not match what we were doing privately. And I thought at the end of the day, we're being asked if we're honest in all of our dealings.
Mm-hmm.
And here, an organization, we are not being honest with the world in this dealing. We're telling the world we're not involved. When we clearly are involved, we're soliciting donations, we're organizing rallies, and at the same time, what I'm hearing in leadership meetings is that this is like Zion's camp. This is a test of faithfulness, and the donations will determine future callings. And so I I kind of put my head down, didn't do much or say much. But one Saturday, I found myself out trying to get people to the signs in their yards. And I knocked on a door, and the woman answered, and I could see it was a Saturday morning, and kids were kind of playing in the back of the house. The sunlight was streaming through the window, and I explained my position, and she smiled. And when it came time to ask if I could put a sign in her yard, she said, no, thank you. I don't support Prop 8, and my wife doesn't either. And I realized that I had become the persecutor, that out of all of the religions in the world that had been pushed from town to town and state to state and place to place because of their non-traditional beliefs in marriage, that I really was the last person to be showing up on someone's doorstep on a Saturday saying, "You're not welcome in my neighborhood." And my conscience was pricked, and I took my signs and I threw them away. And shortly after that, I was replaced by a member who actually had donated a lot, and I was released from my calling. And so I moved to Southern California, tried to keep my head down, tried to avoid leadership. And it was in 2013 in April conference when President Uchtdorf stood up and in his very German accent said, "Doubt your doubts," and everybody remembers that. But what is not as well remembered from that conference talk was that he said, there are good reasons for leaving the church. And he said, past leaders have made mistakes. To me, that was remarkable because I had never heard anybody say past leaders had made mistakes. I'd never heard that from the pulpit in a conference session. And immediately I thought, what leaders, what mistakes? That's kind of a shocking revelation. And it's not like a giant surprise to me that they don't have him in the first presidency anymore. And but aside from that, I was thinking about that and pondering that. And then in December of 2013, we got the first of the essays. And this essay was the Race and the Priesthood essay. And as I read this essay, here it is now. 78 is when I first realized we might be racist. I specifically asked my bishop, are we racist? I was told we were not. I was given a book that had reasons why we were not. And now here it is, 2013, decades after I've served and I've raised my children and I've been, as good a Mormon as I was capable of being, kind of filled the measure of my creation, given my crazy background. Here I was reading an essay that basically disavowed those teachings, disavowed me, disavowed all prior members, and disavowed prior leaders. And in my mind, I thought, if these policies were just the policies of racist men in racist times doing racist things and they were never from God, isn't it possible that these policies that are so homophobic are just homophobic men in homophobic times doing homophobic things? Or the things that Kate Kelly was talking about, could it be that these are just sexist men in sexist times doing sexist things? How was I to know what was from God and wasn't from God? If either they were lying then or they're lying now. But that created a huge faith crisis for me.
Were you surprised that it had taken you that long to discover doctrines about your own church? Because I know for myself, it was 40 years before I had heard of Joseph Smith using the stone in the hat. I was like, where was this when I was in seminary? And teaching gospel doctrine. These essays came as a surprise to me.
Well, the other thing that happened is my oldest son, he left the church when he turned 18, and he's kind of a secular Buddhist. And he had shown me this episode of South Park. And in this episode of South Park, they've got Joseph Smith looking at a rock and hat. I defended the church. I told him, I said, Jared, that's very funny, but that's not the way it went down. That is not what we believe. I was never taught that. Never anything. And the funny thing is, I've got a lot of friends that went to BYU, and when a lot of this stuff came out initially, I would actually watch their thought process change. So initially they would say, that's not true, that was never taught, and eventually would morph into, oh, I learned that at BYU years ago.
Now they're an apologetic.
Exactly, but it's like, wait a minute, you started, when I showed you this information, you told me that it wasn't true and it was never taught, and within weeks, it literally is, oh, I learned that at BYU years ago, it's nothing. It's like,
what's ironic, my son showed me that same clip from South Park.
Right.
It was hilarious.
Yeah, that's why I told him, I said, it's very, very funny, but it's just not. just not accurate. So imagine my surprise when the essay comes out that says, oh yeah, there was a rock, there was a hat, there was a pretty much South Park got it right. And I'm like, well, there you go.
They knew more about your religion than you did.
Right. And then the other essay came out that basically said, well, we're really not sure whether or not we're going to get our own planet. And I'm like, come on, I've already designed my animals. I've got my, my planet is like halfway done. What was the whole point of sitting through Sunday school if I didn't get my own planet? I mean,
Right.
that's ridiculous. So, and then they started walking away from, and then when I found out that Cain probably wasn't Bigfoot, why, that was just the last straw. Like, if Cain isn't Bigfoot, then why have I paid tithing all these years?
I used to live in Washington State, and the church house that we went to, right across the street was this huge mountain, and the incline was so steep, there was a path, and I used to park right next to it because I was fascinated with it, and I thought, the only person who can slide down that mountain is Cain.
Yeah, Cain, yeah. If he's able, yeah. That's But yeah, I used to imagine because I would wonder, where are the three Nephites? I would imagine, well, the three Nephites, they're out hunting Cain. It's like, I'd watch that show, do the Bionic Man and then do the three Nephites hunting Cain. That would be a great TV show. Every episode, they get closer, but he slips away and maybe
still may have something there.
Yeah, could be. It could be. I don't know that anybody would watch it, but I'd watch it. So,
yeah. So then you went on to do some research, correct?
So basically then, it didn't do much at that point, but I actually started, I met with, actually talked with Jeremy, Jeremy became active on Reddit. I became active on Reddit, and kind of opened my mind up to, Mithrin was one of the former moderators there, and just started to realize, there's a lot more there than what I was told was there. Mm-hmm. And one of the shows I loved as a kid was Scooby-Doo, but one of the other shows we loved as a family was Frosty the Snowman, but the videotape we had made cut out right after Frosty melted. So whenever our kids would watch it, it's like Frosty melted and he never comes back. And so, that story was traumatizing because it didn't have that ending, that happy ending. But in Scooby-Doo, the endings were always the same. This supernatural thing that had scared everybody, oh, it's just the janitor in a mask, or oh, okay, so it's not supernatural. There's an explanation for it. And one of the things I was surprised is Elder Holland actually gave a couple of talks. And in one of the talks, he said, we don't require people to literally believe the Book of Mormon is true. And I thought, what? Because that's really not the message that I've been getting. I kind of thought we were required to believe that.
It's the only true book on the face of the planet is what I was told.
Right. And then I started to realize that when I looked at the Temple Recommend questions, there's no Temple Recommend question that asks us about whether or not the Book of Mormon is true. And then Elder Holland had this other talk where he said, how could an ignorant farm boy write a book of over 500 pages of semantic complexity that blah, blah, blah? It's like, how could he do that? I thought, well, that's a good question. But that's not an answer. That's just a question. And I realized we're like in a Scooby-Doo episode where we have this supernatural thing that happened, but we don't have a plausible explanation. And as I looked at the different plausible explanations, one of them that's been floating around is the Spalding-Rigdon theory. Mm-hmm. And I looked at this and I thought, well, the timing is off and it's this crazy conspiracy theory and it doesn't make any sense. And Sidney Rigdon he'd already written fake scripture. He'd written a book of Peter that was actually pretty funny. If he'd wanted to do this, he didn't really need to go find an almost homeless family in the middle of nowhere to do it. He was quite capable of doing that on his own. And the Spalding connection was tenuous at best, and all the arrows were pointing the wrong way. And we don't actually have the lost manuscript. We have what he actually wrote, and it's not bad, but it's not, to me, it wasn't that Scooby-Doo, aha, that explains it.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, if I did a little, and originally, because I'm a funny guy and I do a lot of funny memes on the internet and people actually appreciate my humor, originally I was going to do kind of a tongue-in-cheek satire of Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling called Rough Stone Trolling. And so that I kind of set out to,
perfect.
Yeah, to just kind of I'm just going to do something funny. I mean, it's something, we do kind of an extended South Park, in writing. I thought that would be cool. But as I got into it, One of the places that I went first was the place that everybody went, and that was Lucy Mack Smith, the prophet's mother. And as I got into it, my first thought was, again, I love my mother, but my mother was crazy. And so as I'm reading the things that Lucy wrote, I'm realizing she's kind of a crazy woman. She is just kind of out there. There's things that she's writing about. And then I'm looking at this and going, wait a minute, Brigham Young didn't like what she wrote. He actually not only didn't like what she wrote, when it got published, he tried to have it banned and burned, and warned everybody under damnation and condemnation that you teach your kids what's in these books that Lucy writes, and you're going to lose your testimony. It's a tissue of lies. You shouldn't be. And within decades after his death, they turned all these stories that Brigham Young had warned people not to be exposed to. They turned them into a series of children's stories and published them in what was the equivalent of the Friend back in the day.
Oh, no.
So I'm looking at this going, within months after the death of Hiram and Joseph, Lucy in her 70s writes this book that's over 300 pages that Brigham buys and then buries, and then when it sneaks out, bans and warns everybody under condemnation from heaven not to teach people what's in there. And within decades, people are going, we don't know what Brother Brigham thought was so wrong about that. Why, these are great stories. And they publish them, and those are a lot of the stories that we still tell and love today.
Wow.
So
did you think he was buying the only copy?
I think he thought he was buying the only copy, because he certainly buried it and was certainly shocked and surprised when somebody it was Martha Corey that had the foresight to make a backup copy. It actually, as it turns out, he had the backup copy and she kept the original.
Oh, okay.
But then as I started to look at her stories, in my mind, so I'm a computer guy. I write a lot of technology, and a lot of my programs have like millions of lines of code. And so
Wow.
I'm able to like take my programs and kind of boot them up into my head and see how they connect and debug them. And so I decided to kind of do the same thing with not only her book, but with our theology. And when I was kind of debugging Mormonism, I kept thinking, well, if this doctrine is true, well, then this one over here is, and if this one here, then this one here. So there's kind of if you never look at the whole picture, then you can get an answer to any little, question that you have that satisfies that shuts that question down. It's kind of like, remember when you move and you have the boxes with the flaps? So
Mhm.
and you put this flap over this flap over this flap. And as long as all the flaps are down, every flap is covering another flap, but being covered by a flap.
Right.
And if you only pull one flap up, then you can put it back down. The interesting thing about Jeremy Runnels' work is that his letter pulls all the flaps open at once.
Mhm.
And so you cannot there's nothing really going around putting all the flaps back down.
Mhm.
But people will attack one aspect of that, but it's like, well, that's just one flap. That's just one issue.
Right.
Here is 80 pages of issues that need to be addressed.
Right.
And whereas somebody researching on their own, especially pre-internet, might be exposed to one issue that would kind of raise questions that could then be quelled. What Jeremy did is he basically created kind of a thought bomb that opened up all the questions simultaneously. And as I was doing my research, I had a lot of time on my hands. We were in a luxury condo on the beach in Penang, and we had high-speed internet, and I speed read. And so
Mhm.
as I started to do all of this, I started to have a lot more questions. The first thing that I doubted Lucy's story.
Mhm.
And what was surprising to me was that every other historian, Mormon, former Mormon, non-Mormon, they all looked at Lucy's material as valid source material, and nobody had ever bothered to question her stories. And one of the stories, I speak a little bit of Mandarin and know a little bit about Chinese culture, and she's got this story where her husband loses a lot of money selling ginseng to China. Okay, right, and it's like, well, that's an odd story, and
Yeah.
and everybody kind of mentions it in passing, but again, as I'm thinking about all of her stories, this one is like, this doesn't make sense. In her story, he crystallizes ginseng, which requires dicing it up. The value for ginseng in China is that the root is shaped like a body, and the more it's shaped like a body, the more chi or energy it has in it.
Mhm.
So what she's talking about is taking a body-shaped root out of the ground and cutting it up and selling it to China, which would not make sense because it would have no value if you did that. Then her timeline is wrong because the amount of time it takes to transit from the United States to China and back, it requires a lot more time than her story allowed for.
Mhm.
And then in her story, the people that kind of take command of Joseph Sr.'s cargo of diced ginseng, which would have absolutely zero market value, But in her story, you know, somebody else takes command of that. The person that takes command of that is not the person that would have taken command of that. That's not the way trade worked with China. And then they end up with a chest full of treasure, which again, the Chinese never traded gold and silver. They traded goods from China that then had to be sold and turned into gold when you got back to the country you were importing and exporting from. So her story was completely full of holes. And then on top of that, the guy ran off with all the money that was supposed to be Joseph Sr.'s, ran off to Canada and was never seen again. So I'm looking at her story going, her story doesn't, why would she be telling this story? And I realized anybody who had lived in upstate New York during the time that this story would have taken place would have known that her story was fabricated. The only people that wouldn't know that it was not a true story would be people that had no knowledge of these things, or people that hadn't been around then, or people that hadn't thought that much about it. And because it's not connected to any spiritual aspect of her book, many of the historians just kind of skipped over it. But to me,
I never heard of that story until you.
Right. But that's Lucy's kind of establishing that her family is fallen on hard times. And she uses this as an example of Joseph Sr. is really hardworking. Ignore the fact that he was most likely an alcoholic and didn't really like to work that hard. Here, my explanation is that you might have heard, you know, again, she's kind of writing this, wanting to exonerate her, you know, she's the storyteller. And if she's going to tell the stories, her husband's going to be a hardworking guy that lost money, you know, in a bad ginseng deal. That
sounds so much better than he's a lush.
Yeah, he's a lush. He's an alcoholic. But again, the thing is that she would have had access because she would, you know, she had enough of the details. She would have known exactly what the Chinese were buying and not buying. She could have actually made a plausible story, but she made a story that was obviously implausible, but only to the right person, only to the right audience. Then she has these other stories where she's doing these death and sickness scenes of family members. And again, everybody's taking these at face value. But I'm looking at this and I'm cross-referencing with other information available on the internet. And it's like, holy cow, this sister that is sick and dying and then kind of recovers from that, she's a stand-in for Anne Hutchinson, who's an early American religious figure who was murdered by Indians. But this whole story is basically, and not only that, the amazing thing to me is that Mother Lucy, she's quoting verbatim from Anne Hutchinson, which tells me, I started to look at this and go, holy moly, Lucy Mack Smith in her 70s is a very bright woman. And she is referencing, you know, other religious stories, and she's putting them in her book, and she's putting them in with really amazing detail. Then she has one of her other relatives quoting St. John of the Cross. And I'm like blown away as I'm realizing there is more to this woman than I thought.
Yeah.
And then we get to the story of Joseph's boyhood operation. And here, what's damning here isn't what she says, it's what she doesn't say. Okay, that at this point the family is living in and around Hanover, actually, and they kind of were back and forth between Vermont and New Hampshire. But in this story, she can't remember the name of the doctor. Okay, we now know the name of the doctor was Nathan Smith. Okay, her name is Lucy Smith, and it just, she can remember verbatim quotes from Anne Hutchinson. She can quote St. John of the Cross, but she can't remember the name of Dr. Nathan Smith. That's not in there.
It's only half a name she has to remember.
Exactly. It's just Dr. Smith. She also mentions that her son is going to a charitable academy, that Hiram is attending a charitable academy, but she can't seem to recall the name of the charitable academy. It's like, okay. So to me, again, it was like, and everybody kind of glosses over that, but since then, the descendants of Nathan Smith have made a big deal that he saved the Mormon prophet. But what they don't like to talk about is Nathan Smith's reputation back in that day. And the reason you wouldn't actually mention Nathan Smith in a book back in that day is that doctors, in particular doctors that were just starting to create modern medicine in early America, they really weren't famous. They were infamous. And everywhere Nathan Smith went, he was run out of town as a grave robber. So he wasn't digging up root-shaped bodies and cutting them up. He was digging up actual bodies and cutting them up.
Right.
And on top of that, he was at Dartmouth at the time. And Dartmouth had an academy called Moore's Academy, but it was a charitable academy that was only for Indian children. And so in Lucy's story, somehow her son Hiram is attending a charitable academy that's supposed to be only for Indian children that is part of Dartmouth. And so I'm looking at this going, Why is she leaving out Dartmouth? Why is she not remembering Nathan Smith? What does that have to do with anything? And when I dug further, I realized that Lucy and her husband, Joseph Sr., had a cousin named John Smith, who was a professor of religion at Dartmouth. And not only was he a professor of religion at Dartmouth, that there he had kind of created this brand of Christianity called, he hadn't created it, he had adopted it, and it was one of the things that he had taught. The name of his church at Dartmouth was called the Church of Christ. The lessons that he taught his students were done under the title of the School of the Prophets. The things that they taught included, are there people living on other planets? Justice and mercy, that we lived before we came here, that there are multiple degrees in heaven. And these were all things that had been taught from the late 1700s through 1809 when Professor Johnny died, but they were continued on being taught at Dartmouth several years after that, and would have been taught when Hiram showed up. And
so did he have an occult or Masonic background?
Dartmouth was ground zero for Masonry. Masonry was kind of like the LinkedIn of the day. And if you were going to be a student at Dartmouth, Dartmouth was basically like the Protestant BYU. Its goal was to turn out young men to make them missionaries and ministers to the Indians. That was why they were chartered, why they were funded. And Professor Johnny's teachings were part and parcel of that. And along with that, you couldn't boot up one of these guys and have him go out into the new America if he was not also a Freemason. And so Dr. Johnny was a Freemason, and he taught the lessons in Freemasonry. The boys were prepared to be Freemasons. In Freemasonry, they learned about the Order of Aaronic. They learned about the Order of Melchizedek. They learned about all these different appendant ceremonies and rites. So at the time, in the early 1800s, Dartmouth was a school for turning out ministers and missionaries to the Indian, medicine men under the tutelage of Dr. Nathan Smith, who cut up bodies, and Freemasons. And on top of that, Dr. Johnny encouraged his students to reason together, and he created two different debating societies called the Socials and the Freighters. So they didn't have sports, what they had was debates. And Daniel Webster was actually a student of Dr. Johnny and went on to become a great orator and among other things. But the environment there was, when you showed up at Dartmouth, you would align yourself with the Socials of the Freighters. The alumni would donate books, and each of these debating societies had libraries with thousands of books worth a lot of money. Dr. Johnny was also in charge of the library at Dartmouth, and he also ran the bookstore in town. So you have this place in the middle of the woods that was funded specifically to teach how to Christianize Indians, that has a singular mission for doing that, and also is churning out doctors and Freemasons. And none of this is mentioned in Lucy's book. And again, Dr. Johnny's church is called the Church of Christ. When we look at what happened when the Smith family decided to actually create a religion in Ohio, the first church was called the Church of Christ.
Right.
When they wanted to teach the men, the first school was called the School of the Prophets. Now, it's not like there weren't, prior, in the 1700s, a lot of religious schools called their schools the School of the Prophets, but the Dartmouth in the early 1800s was one of the last ones to do that. And at the same time, there was a schism in the church, in the school, because the board members, the trustees, there were trustees that believed in kind of the free love, let us reason together, think whatever you want. Hey, maybe Cain is Bigfoot, even though they didn't have Bigfoot. But there was kind of like this, you're okay to think whatever you want to think, and we're not going to kick you out, and we can still, fellowship. And at the same time, there were Calvinist trustees that believed very strongly that we have to control the theology, we have to tell you what to believe, and you cannot be free to dispute that. And if you do, we'll basically kick you out. Wow. So over time, what happened is that, and one of the things that brought it to a head was as the grave robbing of Nathan Smith became more and more known and infamous, that the trustees with the Calvinist background would use that as an example of, this is why you cannot just let people teach whatever they want. This is why you have to control the doctrine. You have to control the members. You have to control the students. You have to,
sure.
You have to have a very, very tight control. And there was one time where they marched into the debating societies and tried to steal all their books. And the students rose up and marched the teachers back home and said, no, that's not going to happen. But eventually, after Johnny Smith died, after John Wheelock died, and after others died at Dartmouth, by the time 1816 rolls around, we've got a couple of things happening in the world. The year before in Indonesia, a volcano went off that kind of blanketed the world in darkness. 3 days of darkness down in Indonesia. Entire, cities and villages destroyed, land lifted up and torn down. And one of the side effects of that was around the world, it was extremely cold the next year. And that was known as the year without a summer. There were Canadians killing each other for food. Canadians. Now, I could see Americans too, but these are Canadians killing each other for food. So it was pretty bleak, but it was in that day too that Professor Nathan Smith, the doctor, was eventually run out of town and went on to form a medical school at Yale. But that's also the year that the Smith family was warranted out of town. They had been living with the Mack family in a home owned by one of the more free love trustees, one of the Professor Johnny's trustees, but they were kicked out of town. And that was the year also when kind of the teachings of Professor Johnny stopped being taught at that school. And in 1816, as the Smith family is looking at where to relocate, Joseph Sr.'s family would have invited them to their farms. They had plenty of farms, and Assail had a bad childhood, really wanted all of his children to be together. And Joseph Sr. and Lucy had kind of estranged themselves. Assail had given out family blessings and just showered blessings and praise on everybody. But when it came to Lucy, he basically said, as for my daughter-in-law, nature finds itself, and I'm not going to say any more. And so that was her blessing from him in 1799. And for some reason, that kind of created a rift in the family.
Well, so before we move on, I want to ask a question real quick. Do you find the surgery that Nathan Smith or Nathaniel Smith did on Joseph as a child, is that a legitimate story, or was that taken from Ignatius of Loyola? Because I find those stories
yes,
ridiculously parallel.
Well, then let's take a look at what happens to when he recovers. Okay, so she sends him to Uncle Jesse in Salem to recover when he's about 8 years old. He's born in 1805. That means he's recovering in 1813, and she sends him to Salem with Uncle Jesse. We know there's a rift in the family. Uncle Jesse doesn't think much of Lucy or Joseph, so I don't know why she would send them to an uncle that she's kind of on the outs with. But more importantly, every school child in America knows what happened in 1812. It's the old joke. When was the War of 1812? It was in 1812, and it was still going in 1813 and 1814, and it was basically a naval battle, and Salem was the battlefront. So I'm reading this story, and I'm going, wait a minute now, I'm supposed to believe that she's, this 8-year-old boy who's been near death is now being sent to a relative that you're on the outs with, to the battlefront of the War of 1812, and that's where you're going to send him by himself to recover. To me, that story doesn't make sense. And again, I'm looking at it going, everybody's accepted it hook, line, and sinker, but it doesn't make sense to me, and nobody's questioned it. So I look at that and go, yeah, and as you've mentioned, there are a lot of parallels to other religious stories. So her whole book is drawing all of these parallels, and again, there's things that she does say, and then there's things that she doesn't say. And to just going back to Elder Holland's message of how could an ignorant farm boy write a 500-page book, blah, blah, blah. This is a 70-year-old woman who in less than a year with one scribe writes a 300-page book that has scriptures and visions and references. And it's amazing. And if it wasn't for the systemic sexism in our culture in general and in our religion in particular, I think people might have suspected that Lucy had a role in the Book of Mormon sooner. But we look at that and go, who could have possibly helped write this? And here she is 20 years older, and she writes 300 pages all on her own.
Well, the illusion has always been, because they put Joseph in front of us as this poor, uneducated farm boy, we assume that everybody else in the family is. That was my assumption.
Right, and we don't even have to look at whatever school record she had. We don't need to know her credentials. She left a book. So we know that she's capable of writing a book, and it's an amazing book. And not only that, when she talks about the saints migrating to Ohio, she is the first person that basically compares herself to Lehi. She says, I am like Lehi. I am, blah, blah, blah. I am leading the saints. I'm on a boat. And she goes over and over, makes a big deal out of how she is like Lehi. And so that becomes important later on in my research. But if we put a pin in that and go, wait a minute now, if she is like Lehi, if she is comparing herself to Lehi, you know, what is this first chapter in the Book of Mormon? What is going on there? Okay, is this a story about something else? But what happened, going back to 1816, here we have Canadians killing each other because there's no food. We have Dr. Nathan Smith being run out of town because they're sick of him robbing graves. We have tremendous religious excitement at Dartmouth, people wondering which church to join, low here, low there. We've got Lyman Spalding, who is a relative of Solomon. He doesn't know which of these factions to join. He goes off into the woods near the water. He prays, he sees a bright light. He's convinced that he needs to fill his mission to the Indians, except he actually thinks it's the real Indians from India. So he actually leaves and goes to India, and he spends 80 years, you know, over there. But all of the students at Dartmouth at the time, both in the academy and in the college itself, would have been aware of, I mean, they all talked about, you know, Lyman didn't know which church to join, didn't know what to do, and had this visitation, and off he goes. At the same time, Lucy's father, Solomon, had written a book about his conversion, and he's riding around side saddle on a horse, selling it to everybody and making some money selling a religious book. And in his book, his conversion experience is him in bed at night when bright light comes into his room and calls him to repentance. And we know that Solomon wasn't capable of writing a book, but somebody helped him write that book. And we also see that Lucy has excerpts from that book all over her book. So somebody helped her dad write a book that had religious conversion experiences, miraculous religious conversion experiences, and that he made money on. And that's kind of how he you know, was making money in the last days. So in his last days. So all of this stuff we're not told about. The other thing we're not told is that Hiram, when Hiram goes into this, what is essentially Dartmouth, you know, when people want to segregate the Charitable Academy from Dartmouth, they forget this is not a big school. So these schools are physically in the same buildings. They have the same classes, the same teachers. Mm-hmm. So it's not like there's these two separate entities. They are basically the same thing. It's just a matter of accounting. Now, in Moore's Academy, the accounting for that, the money for that came from a donation from Scotland. And they were a little worried about Eleazar Wheelock actually using it to train white kids. So they specifically said, none of our money can be used in this academy to train and teach anyone except Indian children. So if Hiram is going to this academy, he's at a charitable academy, but he is not eligible for the charity that is funding the academy. So however he's going there, the money is coming from someone else for something else. And at the same time, his cousin Stephen is also attending this academy, but his cousin Stephen is also not an Indian. So Stephen's tuition is being covered by someone else for something else. And the family doesn't have a lot of money. They're kind of living together in a trustee's house. And old Solomon is riding around side saddle on a horse, hawking his religious book that tells everyone what a sad sack he is until he found God. And so in looking at all of this, we're looking at this going, why would somebody pay to have these boys go to this school? And why would they be forced out at the same time the teachings of Johnny Smith are ended, at the same time there's a year without a summer, at the same time Nathan Smith is kicked out? Why did they lose their housing and their tuition at the same time and are forced to leave? What is so special about? So I look at that and go, it's all coincidence and conjecture, but it seems awfully strange. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's worth noting is that when Hiram attended this school, his name was the Masonic spelling of Hiram, Hiram. So his birth name was a Masonic spelling of the name. Later, when they moved 300 and plus miles away to Palmyra, his name is changed to the biblical spelling, Hyrum. Now, some apologists have said, well, that's because of the Captain Morgan incident, blah, 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 blah. The Captain Morgan incident doesn't happen until, 1828, 29, and 30. Mm-hmm. The family moves there in 1816. So maybe they put the rock in the hat and realized this was going to be a possible problem later on, or maybe they were trying to hide the Masonic origins of Hiram's name mm-hmm. by giving it a biblical name. So anyway, these are all the things as I was looking at Lucy's story, I was looking at this going, what would Brigham Young think of all of this? Why would he alone have a problem with this? Now, Brigham Young at 31 had just lost his wife when he was introduced to the Book of Mormon. He'd also just lost his masonry because this was at the height of the Morgan affair. And the number of Masons in upstate New York had gone from over 30,000 to less than a couple of hundred. And he loved both his wife and he loved masonry. what would there be in the Book of Mormon that he would see that would draw him to that? And what would there exactly what would there be in Lucy's story in particular that he would denounce as a tissue of lies and see as an existential threat to the religion? That's something that you shouldn't teach these stories, you shouldn't tell these stories, that you shouldn't do anything or say anything about Mother Lucy. So to me, that's where this all began to get very, very interesting. I realized that a lot of the stuff, it wasn't just the official stories that I had been told, that I had just swallowed hook, line, and sinker. I realized there were a lot of stories that I had not been told, and a lot more stories than the stories that they're telling now. So they're coming clean about the rock and the hat, but they're not coming clean about the fact that Joseph's older brother, who he was inseparable with after the church started, for some reason, when the Book of Mormon comes along, he's distanced from him, and he's kind of, Joseph's out there doing it, and Hiram's back here. Well, I've got nothing to do with that. But we never learned or were told that Hiram was educated at Dartmouth. You know, if he was, we know what an education at Dartmouth was like. He would have learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. That the family's cousin had been the professor of religion there, and had also written the books on languages, had written the books on Greek and Hebrew, has gotten letters from Thomas Jefferson, thanking him for his contribution to both religious instruction and language instruction. And that there is a body of work that Professor Johnny had left that you could look at. We're not told about any of that.
How much time did he spend at Dartmouth?
At least 3 years. He would have spent one more year there, but again, the family was forced out of town. And on top of that, we look at the family being forced out of town. You could see Joseph Sr. arguing for this forced relocation after this calamitous event with the year without a summer, saying, hey, let's go to my family. Let's go to the land of my inheritance. Let's just go back there. And it's clear that Lucy is going, no, I've had visions and dreams that we need to go to Palmyra. And so Lucy kind of directs the family there. And what's interesting in her story about their relocation is that she has them stopping, and in her book, she doesn't describe an actual place. She describes it in reference to another place. It's like, oh, so many miles east of this, blah, blah, blah. But it's a well-known city. But when you actually look at the city and you understand the history of the city, this was a city that was created by Samson Occam, who was an Indian. And it was a city that he created for the Brotherton Indians, which was a group of Christian Indians. And when you look at again, somebody from upstate New York would have been very aware that she's claiming that they stopped in the city where there really wasn't. She's also claiming that they stopped at a bar. They'd really had a problem with bars in this particular city, but be that as it may, her stopping here is not just a mere coincidence. It's a shout out to Samson Occam. Samson Occam was the Indian that was trained by Eleazar Wheelock. He was the Indian that was sent on a multi-year mission to England to raise money for what would become Dartmouth. And on top of that, he saw himself as more of a Scottish Protestant. When he was invited to stay in England, he said, no, I don't, as much as I enjoy it here and as much as I enjoy raising money here, I'm really from the land in the South. And so he traveled over Hadrian's Wall into the South and preached there, and was somewhat dismayed that the mother church wasn't as diligent as Eleazar Wheelock had taught him to be. And when he came back with all of this money, millions and millions of modern day dollars, that Eleazar took that money to fund Dartmouth, but he put it in an area of the country where the enemies of Samson's tribe were. So this money wasn't used to educate Samson's Indians, it was used to educate the enemies of Samson. And so Sam Occam never ever set foot on Dartmouth and became estranged with Eleazar and kind of went out and created his own colony somewhere else. But over at Dartmouth, they named buildings and ponds after him. They told his stories and legends. Everybody knew about Sam the Indian and what a wonderful, righteous man he was, and how, this was all part and parcel of the training. He was the poster child for why Dartmouth even existed. That if Sam Occam, who was a heathen, could become a Christian, that we can learn here how to do the same thing. And so the fact that there was, and also a lot of people really kind of confused his name. He was pen pals actually with Johnny Smith and with other famous religious people of the day. He'd given an execution sermon when there was a guy named Moses Paul who killed a white guy and was executed. And they had Samson Occam come in to give the execution sermon. That was published.
Wow.
It was reprinted multiple times, and that's where Samson had gotten his own money that he could go start his own city of Christian Indians that was self-funding. So again, Lucy's she's leaving out information, she's dropping pointers, she's dropping hints. Then she includes Masonic words and Masonic symbols in there. And you're looking at all of this going, why would Brigham Young, a 31-year-old Freemason at the time he joins the church, what was it that he saw? And what was that he saw in Lucy's book that that would cause him concern? So that was it was a couple of months into my research as I started to connect all these dots together. And I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't just generating a giant pile of confirmation bias. So, I got some.
So did you have a Mason background? Did you have to study Freemasonry so you could pinpoint what she was referring to, pick out symbols, words, references?
Yeah, so pretty much what happened there is I realized I had to boot up myself as if I were a Freemason, both at the time that Brigham Young joined the church to see whatever it was that he saw in Mormonism, and at the time later on. And to do that, I had to study Masonry, and I had to. But again, the nice thing is that all of those texts are available. The other thing is, and that's why my book actually goes all the way back to John Dee, and just prior to John Dee, when I realized that John Dee, the occultist and the Queen's magician, when I realized that he had an onyx mirror from the Aztecs, I went back to the Aztecs, and that's where my book starts. So much of the early chapters of my book happened before Mormonism. Because originally, and actually the subtitle for my book is Stolen Treasures, because there's so much that happens before the Mormons, before Joseph Smith and his family comes along. There's so much there that if you do not understand that context, then you can't have that Scooby-Doo moment where you look at that and go, oh, okay, there's a plausible explanation for this.
I'm so glad you're saying that, because when I have gone into all the videos that I've done regarding the ordinances or the rituals, I break them down from a metaphysical and an occult background, because that's what these were founded on, not Christianity.
Right.
So you can understand those ordinances the way they were truly, the way they were truly formed and originated from, unless you have an occult perspective.
Right. And the thing that I found surprising is that most historians see the Masonic influences in what's called the High Nauvoo period. And now what I'm finding is a Masonic influence from the very beginning. The Smith family is not only heavenly Masonic, but a lot of their early converts are Masons.
Yes.
And this is at a time when Freemasonry is on the outs. And so I'm looking at this going, is this a plausible explanation? Is somehow, if Mormonism is basically Masonry or a form of Masonry from the very beginning, does that help resolve some of these things that we don't understand? There's some things that just seem supernatural. Is there a natural explanation for them? And that's what I found. But you're absolutely right that so many of these things that where we see a Masonic influence, Masonry was a form of magic. It was a form of science, and pretty much by the time the church rolls around or comes into creation, most people understand now that the true alchemy of Masonry is what it can do to a man's personality, that has the ability, its charter is to make good men better. And so all of the stuff that looks like, oh, it's just a LinkedIn of the day, it's just a fraternal organization, it's just an old boys network. When you actually look into the different rituals of Freemasonry, it really is designed to teach a man a worldview that makes him part of a fraternity, but also makes him more charitable, more connected, more in tune, and really does try to make him a better person. Sometimes at the expense of people that aren't part of the group, but that's one of the unintended consequences. But it really was there were noble goals then. And one of the chapters I have, I go all the way back to the burning in London. I go all the way back to King James, and the realization that for the Bible of Milton and Shakespeare was not the King James Bible. That was considered to be the Masonic Bible, and for very good reason. So the fact that is even the Bible that we adopted from the very beginning, that's Masonic.
Most people don't realize it was actually written by Sir Francis Bacon.
And not only that, if you actually look at in the first print in the early 1600s, all of the drawings, everybody's doing Masonic grips. So here's Adam and Eve, and underneath them there's hands that are doing Masonic grips. Well, this caused quite the uproar to the people that were used to the Geneva Bible and the other Bibles of the day. And it was they caused such a big stink that those drawings had to be taken out. So, and you look at that and go, okay, so Masonry is a little bit older than we thought. And then one of the other stories I tell is about the great poet Robert Burns. Robert Burns was pretty much a poor farm boy that was going to have to go become a slave trader in Jamaica because he had no money. And he'd also gotten one of the Grand Mason's daughters pregnant, and he wanted to marry her, but the Grand Mason said, no, you're nobody, nothing. And even though Robert Burns had been heavily involved in Masonry with his brother, he didn't have money and he was going to leave. But he'd written a book of poetry. And he shares that book of poetry at what he considers to be one of his last meetings with the lodge. And one poem in particular is Farewell to the Brethren of the Lodge. And everybody's in tears and crying because it's such a beautiful poem. And Robert Burns says, hey, by the way, I'm selling these books. Well, the Masons buy it and they love it because it's a book of poetry that they can actually keep out and everybody will read it and enjoy it at a secular level. But the Masons, wink, wink, nod, nod, know that there's Masonic references in this book. And so the whole idea that if you're a Mason, you know the story of Robert Burns, you know that made him famous and rich, and he did not have to go be a slave trader in Jamaica. So the idea that you might write a piece of literature that would appeal to Masons and then literally save the farm and save your bacon, this is something that Masons would have been well aware of if you were able to pull that off.
And so the seed was planted with Lucy and Hiram and Joseph Sr.
And Alvin, who was also a Freemason.
Okay.
Now, Joseph Jr. really wasn't entitled to be a Mason because he did have an injury. And one of the requirements was that you had to be, you couldn't be maimed in any way. So his leg injury kind of meant that he couldn't get through Masonry in the front door. The other thing
I did not know that.
The other interesting thing about the Freemasons is that in their first initiation meeting, when they bring you in, you're a neophyte and they bring you into the hall. The lodge itself is situated in such a way that there's a couple men sitting up front on a raised platform. They put your name up for a vote, and deacons walk up and down the pews handing trays to the people sitting there, and you vote. And the votes are these little balls. There's a white ball and a black ball. If you vote, then when all the balls are brought to the front and counted in this big ceremony, if it's all white balls, you're good to go. If there's even one black ball in there, that's where we get the phrase blackballed. If there's one black ball in there, you are forbidden from becoming a Freemason. And not only that, you're forbidden from ever becoming a Freemason. And Joseph Sr. had been blackballed when he was living out in Vermont. By the time the family shows up in Palmyra, Joseph Sr. is passing himself off as a Freemason. So something happened in between there. And that was one of the things the Freemasons were particularly worried about is, could people pass themselves off as Freemasons? Because if you were arrested and charged with something, there were a couple of ways to avoid the law. One was if you were a Freemason and the judge was a Freemason, wink, wink, nod, nod, you get a pass, and you're not held the same justice as everyone else. The other is if you were a doctor. If you were a doctor, you'd get a pass, and the other is if you were a minister. So it was a huge, huge advantage to crooks of the day to pretend to be Masons, ministers, medicine men. And so you can definitely see why people might try to do that. But again, it's more than a little noteworthy that Joseph Sr. had been blackballed early in his life. This was one of the things that Lucy kind of points out as the reasons for a lot of their financial failings. It really was an old boys network. If you were a Freemason, you had it made. You were a made man. They weren't mafia in the sense that they weren't out really killing anybody. It was just a society of people who had committed themselves to doing good. And if you were part of that society, sometimes they'd look the other way.
The brotherhood is first, above everything else.
Okay. Yep.
And they watch each other's back. I can see that.
Yeah.
I can see that.
Yeah. And so there was a huge advantage to the Smith family. So when they show up in Palmyra and Joseph Sr. is able to pass himself off as a Freemason, this is the year without a summer. The family shows up, and Lucy admits they just have pennies to their name, and they've got all these children, and they've been run out of town, and Canadians are killing themselves for food. And this family that could have gone to live with his family shows up here, and they don't only exist, they thrive. That things go really, really well for them somehow. somehow there's a means of income is not readily apparent. They've had no crops in the ground. It wouldn't have mattered if they did anyway. And she admits that their crops back home had failed, even though they're living in a home owned by the trustees where there's really not any crops. There really never were crops or crops. So again, that's another, it's like she's mentioning how 3 years in a row the crops failed. Well, what are they digging up out of the ground? They're not planting anything because that's not on land where there are crops. So whatever it was that they were digging out of the ground that wasn't earning them money, who knows? So, they were well diggers in a town that didn't need wells dug. The town that had been there for decades didn't need wells dug. And they just, again, just a coincidence that they were run out of town at the same time all the grave robbing stopped there.
Wow. So we don't know how they were making their money.
Again, Lucy's book is, she basically says that she's selling oil paintings on canvas. Okay.
And I'd never heard that either.
Yeah, and that sounds all well and good, but again, this is Masonic. That a lot of the Masonic symbols and rituals and talismans and tablets, they're basically oil paintings on canvas. So again, she's kind of dropping this hint in there, because there's people aren't buying that. This is not a commodity. This is not like I'm going to show up with 8 mouths to feed in the middle of a horrible summer where nobody has food or money or anything, and I'm going to live off of oil paintings on canvas. That's just not believable. But again, because she was, the historians look at that and nobody has any reason to doubt her story. They just take all her stories at face value. And to me, all of her stories have to be questioned, because she says that she's going to publish the book and then she never publishes the book. And then Brigham Young basically horse trades her book for half of Nauvoo, so she has resources for her family. And then he buries it in the archives and is shocked and surprised when it actually comes up a little bit later, when Orson Pratt finds a copy. And Orson Pratt tries to use her book to kind of quell the church kind of decided that it was going to change its doctrine and go public with the polygamy. And Orson had released a series of essays explaining that, we really are polygamists. People read the essays, members read the essays, and were outraged because they had testimonies that we weren't. They had gone to church believing that we weren't that they had donated, they had their tithings and everything. So they had fasted and prayed, and they knew that Joseph Smith had not been a polygamist and that he was martyred, and that blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden the church is saying, oh, by the way, we really are, and here's some essays, and just, we know some of you aren't going to believe, but those of you that just keep believing and just look the other way.
Okay, so I have a question for you. I did an interview with John Bystrom a couple of months ago, and he had said that Joseph Smith actually was not a polygamist, but that Brigham, Orson, they had changed, Willard Richards had changed the records to indicate after the fact that they wanted him implicated as the polygamist, as a polyandrer, so that it would take the heat off of them. What do you think about that?
I think it's interesting. And again, part of my focus isn't so much on that aspect of whether or not Joseph was or wasn't, because in my mind, Joseph is a bit player in the entire origin story.
Agreed.
Nobody let's say there's there's a play that wins a Tony on Broadway. Nobody looks at the actor reciting those lines and go, wow, he should get the award for best playwright. He's just reciting the lines that were given to him. If the origins of Mormonism were more of a family affair, if we don't fall for the bright, shiny, oh, look, it's all Joseph Smith, and we look behind that and realize we've got a classically educated brother who's very intelligent, we've got a mother who's very literate, a father who's very literate, and they're quite capable of not just creating a work of literature, but helping to organize this. And on top of that, they have a background with an organization that is very secretive and is quite capable of keeping its secrets. Because people look at things, well, you're talking about a massive conspiracy. It's like, no, I'm talking about a group of people that have a vested interest in working together to keep a secret. And again, there's evidence that there's other organizations like that predate that are at the same time and postdate that. So, this is not like, faking a moon landing where we need, all these blah, 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 blah. All the people that would be required to fake a moon landing, they have no vested interest. They have no common interest in doing that. Okay. But the people that have an interest in creating an origin story that may not be exactly true, yeah, anybody involved in that has a vested interest in doing that. So, but as far as your point to whether or not Joseph Smith was a polygamist or not a polygamist, I think there's a lot of evidence. My personal belief is that he is, but if it turns out that he isn't, well, that's okay too. But it definitely looks like Hiram was. I definitely see that. So.
Okay, so the masterminds behind the Book of Mormon revealed themselves to be who?
Well, again, what we have to do is separate the facts that we know from the conjecture that I'm making. And this is one of the things that is taking a little bit longer in my book, is to basically say, here are historical facts that are unassailable, and inviting historians to come in and try and rip those apart. And if I've got any of the facts wrong, let's change those. Let's see whether or not they're material or not material. We know there was grave robbing. An example of this is saying, we know grave robbing was being done at Dartmouth. We know that was happening while the Smith family was living there. That's a fact. Okay. The conjecture that the Smith family is involved in that is pure conjecture. Most of the people that were involved in grave robbing didn't leave a record. They weren't proud of that. They didn't say, hey, we want the whole world to know that we've done that. Okay. So when we get into exactly what happened, again, I'm not looking for, I don't think it's possible to say this is exactly what happened. And I know beyond the shadow of a doubt that this is true. What I'm looking for is there a plausible explanation? Is there something that could be true? And so when we say, who were the masterminds, I can't tell you who the masterminds were, but I can offer you some conjecture of who they could have been. And who there's a plausible possibility that these were the people involved.
So that's definitely more probable than Joseph, who was completely uneducated.
Right. If we take Holland's question and we just rephrase it and say, how could a very literate family of people that were proven ability to write, complex scripture, actually write a book that had complex scripture? You look at that and go, yeah, well, obviously, Holland, that's self-evident, right?
Right.
So again, you see the beauty of the misdirection, and that the people of the day look at that and go, wow. In fact, when people met Hiram and Joseph, everybody thought Hiram was the prophet. He walked and talked and carried himself as what people considered a man of God would do. And they saw Joseph, and it's like, this guy's like a, good time Charlie. It's like, who's this guy that, this is the prophet? And they're like, and that even made it more. And when Joseph went into prophet mode, it was so radically different than his normal personality that people were just like, wow, look at that. God is speaking through him now. Because normally he's not like that.
And really, he's just a phenomenal actor.
Well, he's got a proven ability to memorize his lines. When he actually becomes a Freemason during the High Nauvoo period, to actually become a Freemason, it involves memorizing a lot of things. It's a very ritualistic ceremony where you have to go over and over again, and you have to sit there, and there's a lot of play acting and rearranging of your wardrobe and repeating things that you've memorized, which is something that I'm sure most of us could never relate to. but
outside of the temple.
Exactly. But the amount of material that you had to memorize to even advance through the ranks of Masonry is something that most people, it took them at least 6 months to do, and Joseph Smith did it in 3 days. So this shows he either had pre-knowledge of what was needed, or that he was able to assimilate it very quickly. But in either case, he was able to basically say what needed to be said to advance that quickly in 3 days. So the other thing that had happened early in his career, when he found himself in jail one time, one of the guards had presented him with a white book, which I think pretty certain was a Bible. And Joseph said, if you don't believe that I have this capability, open that book to any page and I'll tell you what it says. And he was pretending that he was going to be using a seer stone to say whatever was written on that page. But to me, it's more likely that it shows that he had memorized huge passages of scripture, and would be able to do this. Some might call it a parlor trick, but again, it was done to convince people that he had this ability. So we see 2 examples from his life where he had that. The other thing that became very interesting is that the sections of the DNC that came out of the Liberty Jail they're almost verbatim from letters that Hiram wrote 4 days earlier. So Hiram is writing letters to his family and being very specific about, oh God, how long will thy hand be stayed, and blah 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 blah. And he writes these letters, and then 4 days later, Joseph writes these letters that later become scripture, but they are verbatim to Hiram's letters. And the apologists just claim that the brothers were lockstep, that they'd gone through the same experiences, they'd gone through this, they'd gone through that. But again, I look at this and go, to me, it is amazing that Joseph had this capability. The other thing that I find particularly sad is, I do not think that the family was involved in a con for the sake of a con. I do think that they believed themselves to be good people, that Lucy was a good person, that she did feel like if you could bring people to Christ, it didn't really matter how you did that. At the end of the day, if you could bring people to Christ, that was a good thing. In addition to that, the purported role of the priesthood, they took, if you consider Jacob's ladder and masonry to be the steps that you go through to make a good man better, they extended Jacob's ladder down one rung and added this additional make bad men good and good men better. And by doing that, it was a rung that their brother and son Joseph could step on. So I see in many ways him as being a reluctant prophet, and there are multiple times where he tries to throw off the mantle of prophecy to go do something that he would rather be doing, but then it's kind of thrust back on him. And I find it particularly within a week before he was killed, he had tried to not be the prophet anymore, and then he came back and said, well, I guess I am. And we know what his final dream was because there was somebody in jail with him who recorded it. So actually, we don't know what it was. We know what somebody claims it was. Mm-hmm. And in this final dream, Joseph finds himself back in Ohio when it was just him and Emma, and they lived in this house with a picket fence. And it was pretty much everything that he would have ever aspired to. Just the safety and security of this house with the picket fence. And he finds Emma, he sees her there, but he can't get to her. And he's stepping and walking and trying to get to her, but there's mud, and the mud is engulfing him. And he's stuck in the mud, and every step he takes gets him deeper and deeper in mud, and he can't reach her. And to me, we also know that just prior to him going to Carthage, he and Hiram were on a boat headed towards the Rockies, that they were trying to get away. And it was Emma that basically told him, look, if you really are a prophet, then you need to come back. You faced other things. You can face this. You can't abandon us. You can't leave us. And so it was her pleadings that brought him back. And the last, what I see, and again, this is all conjecture on my part, but what I see is somebody who's trying to help his family, a family that's trying to help him, that they really are interested in trying to bring people to Christ and trying to create a community of people that will help each other, trying to give, poor people advantages that in early America that they didn't necessarily have, banding together in a tribal way, which speaks more about humanity than it does about, the criminality. When countries do that, we don't consider them to be criminals. We just consider them to be tribal. And so I see the Mormons acting in a very tribal way, trying to protect their own. And I see Joseph as really a reluctant prophet who's thrust into this role that, although he's very good at it, really wants to be doing something else. You see him running for president. You see him really trying to expand. And he's a very bright and talented individual. But again, I see nothing in any of that requires me to believe that the claims that the family makes and that he makes about how it happened. We also see these claims changing over time. What we see as Christians are introduced to this, early on, most of the members are Masons. As the Christians come in, we kind of see a shift towards a literal belief. And we see the backstory needing to be rewritten, that some of the holes need to be patched up a little bit. We need a first vision. We need this. We need that. These are all the shift to Christianity that happens. And as that happens, some of the earlier Masonic leanings need to be hidden and protected. If I'm right, that would explain why Brigham Young would be very, very upset and concerned about Lucy's book. If it was known that Mormonism was really an envelope of Christianity that was protecting Masonry, I think a lot of the Christians that had been involved would have been very, very upset by that.
Sure. As they are now when they find out.
Right. And again, is what we see now is we see over time a slow cleansing of the Masonic, that, the 5 points of fellowship has been removed from the ceremony, that many of the other things. And now we have this, this great apologist argument that goes, well, these were just the things that were taught in the Temple of Solomon, and therefore the Masons, protected them. The real problem is, as much as I love the Masons, they've revised their own history. And one of the things that they did to get members was to keep kind of leapfrogging each other. So one Masonic group would say, well, we go back to the blah, blah, blah. Well, we go back to Christ. Well, we go back to Noah. Well, we go back to the pre-existence. It's, you see the Masons embellishing their story, and there is no evidence that there were Masons that kept rituals from Solomon secret for that many centuries. It's just is not that's not true, and that's not believable. So that this argument that somehow the Masons had secrets. On top of that, the symbols that we see on our garments, these came straight out of the Enochian angels that were talking to John Dee through the stolen Aztec mirror. These show up in the 1500s. They don't go back. There's nothing that takes them back to the Temple of Solomon.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I did want to go over that. So tie again the origin of the garments to the Enochian magic.
Well, again, it's not the origin of the garments so much; it's the origin of the symbols on the garments.
Okay.
Right, and these symbols are highly Masonic. In fact, I had mentioned Robert Burns. Robert Burns has got these symbols: the compass and the square. These are Masonic symbols. Mm-hmm. So what we have in briefly, the Queen's Magician. That John Dee was a scientist first and foremost. Mm-hmm. So he documented everything that he did. And one day the Queen comes to him and she sees a star in the heavens and she says, "Hey, what does this mean?" And so he's got this giant library of books. So he researches it and he says, "It means that you are to be the new Arthur and I'm to be the new Merlin, and we're to spread the age of Camelot all around the world. And you're supposed to start this conquest where the sun will never set on the British Empire." And this emboldens her to actually do that. So it's kind of funny as I'm looking at all of this, realizing when I was in Malaysia that they all speak English, but they all speak English centuries later because John Dee told the Queen, "This is what you need to do. You need to go out and spread, England everywhere." And had he not said that, I doubt that England would have done that. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that John Dee wanted to know, and again, at that time, people really didn't know what was science and what was magic. And so there really wasn't this whole concept of quackery. And what people did know, and what people believed, is that God was an architect of the universe. And as such, he worked in a scientific way. And that there was a hierarchy of angels that he used to delegate things to. And when you look at that and go, well, that's, some might look at that and go, well, that's as crazy as believing Cain is Bigfoot. But nevertheless, that's what people believed. And they believed that if you could communicate with this hierarchy, depending upon the group of angels that you could talk with, that you could find out about the future, that you could influence events, that you could basically kind of dial yourself in, to God's machine, and that would give you, knowledge and wisdom and advantages.
The angels would reveal the seven sciences of
exactly.
What they call it, 7 sciences of spirituality.
Right. These angels could reveal anything and everything, and at the same time. What John Dee had was a stolen Aztec mirror. This was a polished volcanic ash mirror that had been used in what is now modern day Mexico, but it had been used as part of their religion. So John Dee believed that if he could he knew he didn't have that ability, but he believed if he could find somebody that could look into that, that he could. And John Dee,
scrying, for fortune telling.
That's exactly what he believed. And so, but what he needed somebody of Scottish royal descent, because he was a student of a book called the Scotichronicon. The Scotichronicon was the history of Scotland. It was written by Fordham, and I forget the name of the other gentleman at the moment, but one of them was an earlier historian who wrote on larger books, and the other guy came along and kind of summarized it and annotated it and wrote on smaller books. But this whole thing was the history of Scotland. And in this history, it talks about their wars with the Picts, who were a group of magical people that were there before the Scottish showed up. But the origin of Scotland is basically, according to the Scotichronicon, it goes back to Egypt. when the princess Scotia marries the Greek prince Scathulus, and she's from Sidon, which is a city in Phoenicia, and they basically get run out of town. They wander in the desert for a little bit, then they build ships and head west, and they make it all the way. They stop in Iberia, but eventually make it all the way to what is Scotland and Ireland. And you know, where if you look at a map of Ireland, you got one river running north and all this crazy stuff. And then basically there they land, then they engage in all these wars with the natives that were there. But they bring with them the Egyptian magic of sun worship and stone worship. And that then becomes the Druids of, you know, the Scottish Highlanders and the Druids, and a lot of their beliefs that stones give you the ability to look into the, you know, other realms and other places. That part of the Druid religion is that some stones are for seeing things far away, other stones are for translating things. That this is all part and parcel of that. So, and everybody knows that in the vision of Jacob's ladder, Jacob is resting his head on a stone pillow. That stone is known as the stone of Scone. And that stone was the stone that was put under the throne that all of the monarchs of Scotland were coronated on, until it was stolen by England and recently given back. But this whole idea of the monarchy of Scotland and England is completely and totally connected to this history of stone worship and magic stones. And so John Dee has this magic stone mirror. There are no Aztecs left because they've all died from disease. And he needs somebody that can help him look into this thing. And in his mind, Scottish royalty, well, that would do it, because the Scottish royals are the ones that, you know, the Druidic magic, the white magic, all of this other fun stuff. And so Edward Kelly shows up, and John Dee overlooks the fact that he's had his ears cut off because he was a criminal. He was a convicted con man who'd had his ears cut off. But Edward shows up with what is most likely a falsified genealogy showing that he is Scottish royalty. And so John and Edward purify themselves by fasting and praying, and they sit down at the table, and John opens up his scientific log where he's going to write down whatever Edward sees, and Edward looks into the stone and starts to dictate what he sees. And what he sees are, oh my goodness, it's angels. And not just any angels, it's angels from the city of Enoch. Now, he didn't say anything about an escalator, but it's like he sees angels from the city of Enoch. Now, apparently, this particular stone, I know Uchtdorf has complained Joseph Stone to like an iPhone. This was like an earlier model, so there was no audio. And so what happens when the angels talk, literally next to their head appears a parchment bubble with writing on it. So think about like a comic book, that this is literally what Edward Kelly describes. I see angels, they're from the city of Enoch, and when they talk, I can see their writing, and it's in this alphabet. So the first thing we've got to do, John Dee, is we got to write down this alphabet so we can understand what they're saying. And so that gives rise to the Enochian alphabet. And
You just made it up?
Well, it looks like Edward Kelly. If we believe that Edward Kelly, if we believe he's magical, then he's actually seeing that. To me, what's plausible is he's a Scottish con man who sees a good meal ticket and wants to ride the gravy train, and he sees the guy that works for the Queen. This guy's got an unlimited pocketbook and a giant library, and he's convinced him that he's seeing angels. So John Dee just writes everything down that Edward says he sees, and among the things that he sees, he learns that, oh my goodness, there's an Adamic language, and in this Adamic language, this was the language that Adam spoke. And now let's learn some of that Adamic language. Let's learn words like pay, lay, and ale, and let's write that all down. Oh my goodness, there's symbols that mean things. And so those symbols include the compass and the cross. And again, so those symbols are dutifully recorded in John Dee's scientific journal. Because John Dee at this point thinks that this is all very scientific. He's unlocked a mystery that is amazing. And he's doing this, and everything's going along swimmingly, except for Kelly has also convinced some other royals in other parts of the world that he actually can do alchemy, that he can turn base material into gold, and they believe him and they pay him a lot of money. And when he's not able to do it, they don't think it's because he can't do it. They think it's because he won't do it. And eventually he gets thrown in and out of jail he gets thrown in and out of dungeons and eventually dies trying to escape one of them. But going back to his time with John Dee, Edward Kelly has got other meal tickets that are paying him a lot more money, and he's kind of wanting to wrap and wind this up. And John Dee is begging him, let's do more, let's do more. We're getting so close, we're getting so close. And John is filling journal after journal of these amazing revelations from these Enochian angels that are telling them all this stuff. And one day they sit down after they've purified themselves through fasting and prayer, and Edward looks in and he goes, oh my goodness, no, this can't be. And he's like, what is it? And he says, well, the angels are telling us that they're not going to talk with us unless we have all things in common. It's like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, I think what they want us to do is to swap wives. And and so it's like, imagine that somebody looking at a stone would come up with an idea for non-traditional relationships and then kind of push that off as being from God. But nevertheless, back in the 1500s, it was Edward Kelly doing it with John Dee. And John Dee has to believe, he's invested so much time, he has to believe that this is all from God. He cannot believe that he has been, duped, because he's fasted, he's prayed, he's written in his scientific journal, his reputation's on the line. This has to be real. His whole life is vested in this. And so if God is wanting him to do this, he's got to make the sacrifice. So they sit now at the same time too, is that John and Edward are a couple decades apart, as are John and his wife. So John and his wife and Ed and his wife, they kind of sit down, and we've got this all recorded because John writes all this down. So we know what was said and who said it. And we've got all of that. And they basically say, hey, this is what God wants us to do. Now, Edward's wife is kind of looking at this going, I'm kind of getting the, I don't know. And John's wife is a little less reluctant because she's like, yeah, I've got, old John over here, but there's Edward. And even though he doesn't have ears, he's kind of, they convinced the women to go along reluctantly, or maybe not so reluctantly. And shortly after that, John's wife becomes pregnant. And so, and Edward goes off to be incarcerated by royalty, who believe he will not turn base metal into gold for them anymore. John goes back. Basically, a lot of his family die. His library has been, they had gone over to the mainland. They'd gotten out of England to do most of this research. But John goes back over to England. His library has been ransacked. His reputation's been destroyed. And it pretty much his life is over. But all of his journals are there. And all of these journals form the basis of and are incorporated in to what would become the magic community. And so he becomes a figure in a community, but it was not a position that he sought. It was not a cult that he thought he was dealing in. He thought he was a scientist. And on top of that, many of the other scientists realized there's a message here. If you pretend to be doing things that really aren't science, your reputation will be destroyed. So years later, when other scientists wanted to dabble with these things, they needed an organization that could keep it secret while they figured out what was and wasn't magic and science. And that's one of the roles that masonry plays. And that's one of the roles that these other secret societies play. That when we find out that Newton actually believed in a lot of the stuff that he's not known for, it's because Newton was very careful. He didn't want to pull a John Dee. He didn't want his reputation destroyed. But people still didn't know what was science and what was quackery. And as they were figuring it out, the role of secret societies in helping them do that became extremely critical. So,
yeah, they had to hold their cards close to their chest.
Or they'd be John Deed, or they'd be ridiculed and laughed at and lose their reputation and everything. So, and that's where we get a lot of the scientific method, where the need to have reproducible tests, the need to the whole scientific method comes out of specifically the destruction of the reputation of John Dee. And the fact that his name is not greater known, he actually created much of the instrumentation that Drake used to circumnavigate the globe. He is the reason why England went on its conquest. He is the reason why English is spoken in so many parts of the world. I mean, a lot of this goes back to John Dee, but John Dee doesn't get the credit because many of the people of the day believe that he was tricked by a Scottish con man to look into a stone and write down what he saw.
Now, didn't John Dee, wasn't he the character that James Bond was patterned after? Am I thinking of the right person? Because he used to sign his letters 007 to the Queen, did he not?
Yeah, that's one of those things, and whether that's, I mean, Ian Fleming, definitely was a Freemason, but John Dee believed in symbols greatly, and he did sign his letters, but it wasn't 007. It was he saw himself as the person that would help the Queen see the things that could not be seen with the visible eye, and so to him the symbol was two O's, which were eyes that were closed. So it wasn't 007. It was basically that, and other people were signing with zeros that had their eyes open, but Dee definitely believed that, because he'd spent a lot of time listening to what he thought were Enochian angels. He believed in certain things that also made it up into different flavors of religion, especially religions that had adopted a lot of these things that were based upon that. The Magus, which is a magic book, relies a lot on John Dee's ledgers. But John believed that if you could speak the Adamic language, you could have power over animals. This became the sort of thing that learning this language, that this was the language that God spoke. So learning God's language, learning the Adamic language was a good thing. These were the sorts of things that find their way into not just the occult and mysticism and secret societies, but also eventually into mainstream religions.
Mm-hmm. And now this has become speaking in tongues. That's what they consider the Adamic language.
Yeah, speaking in tongues, but also, again, as a Mormon in the 70s, and going through a lot of our ceremonies in the 70s, we were taught in the temple about the Adamic language. We were taught in the temple that there were certain words that we needed to say. And again, from the same guy that taught me that Bigfoot was Cain, I was taught a lot of other stuff that weren't official. It was not official theology. But there's a lot of fringe Mormon theology that goes into this in greater detail. That if you knew the original Adamic name of an animal, that you could command and control and communicate with that animal. You'll never find that in a seminary manual, but I can guarantee you that there were seminary teachers in California in the 70s that loved, filling our heads with stuff like that.
Wow. See, and if that were true, I would have found seminary much more interesting.
Yeah, my seminary was great, and I actually liked it. I mean, as I got older, I joked that I never missed a day of seminary, that all the days I slept in, I didn't miss it at all. So that's, so yeah, anyway.
So what do we do with the information from here? Your objective is to do what?
Well, my objective is to just look at this, and what I look at is what I see other world religions, and in other world religions, in particular, there are many Jewish sects where they don't kick out those that don't believe what they believe. What I look at is that Aesop taught fables. Mm-hmm. Clearly, they were fables. Nobody believes that there are city mice and country mice and talking clouds, but people can read these and still look at that and say this contains truth, even though it's not literally true. What I look at is the parables that Jesus taught. So it was very clear that Jesus is teaching these things and saying they're parables. And what we have is a body of evidence that shows that there was real alchemy in Masonry and in Mormonism. It does have the ability to make bad men good and good men better, and it has the ability to make bad people good and good people better. I saw this in my mother. My mother's life was much better when she joined Mormonism. What I look at, though, is that the problem that our religion faces right now, the thing that is keeping it from kind of obtaining that world religion status, is that there is this requirement that people literally believe things that are not literally believable, and that you have to profess a belief in something supernatural when you don't need there to be that. It doesn't have to be that way. That there's plenty of good things in our theology that I look at it now and go, I don't really require something to be literally true to find truth in it. And so I don't go around looking at, when we look at human societies all over the world, everyone speaking a different language, nobody goes around fighting wars over whether or not this language is the one true language or that language. So we look at that, and throughout any time, any place, anywhere, and any when, humans create languages and they create religions. Mm-hmm. The purpose of language, there's an evolutionary biological purpose to being able to communicate with each other. And there also appears to be an evolutionary biological advantage to being able to be spiritual together. And right now, what our religion is saying, if I'm right, our religion was created by people who did not literally believe these things and were okay with that, and still were able to reason together to find truths in things that were not true. And were preserving the Masonic heritage that they found very valuable to them and special to them, and they found a way to keep that alive. But along the way, as they opened it up, because it was in an envelope of Christianity, believing Christians came along, and over time, there was this additional requirement that you literally believe these things. And so this litmus test that's there now is that you have to literally believe things. But if Holland is not lying to us, Holland has said in a speech that we will not kick out members who do not literally believe the Book of Mormon happened the way that they say it happened. If he's not lying to us. So if he's not lying to us, I don't have to have a literal belief in the Book of Mormon, and that's okay. If he's not lying to us.
The addendum would be as long as you're a full tithe payer.
I'm sure, but again, that's, on that again, it's depending about who, if you listen to Rock, full tithe payer is what, to me, that's a whole red herring. It's like the whole, should I pay on gross or should I pay on net? And it's like, well, what about neither? Because that's really not what's in the scriptures, and that's
right.
not designed to be. And so, but yeah. So I look at that and go, again, there was a time when I thought that when we say that Jesus is at the head of the church, I literally thought he came down to the board meetings and kind of, people saw him walking through the temples, and he'd show up and sit down and he'd have PowerPoints. And I don't really think that. It's, to me, it just seems like a lot of what we believe. You take the word of wisdom. It's like if God really wanted to save a lot of people, that should have just been 2 words: boil water. Boil water would have done more to help people run and not be weary and walking. Boil water would have been, it's just like, here's some words of wisdom I give to you, just 2, boil water. That also would have been evidence that there was some sort of divine knowledge that was being given to people before science had found it. But it seems like whatever sort of light knowledge we get doesn't really extend beyond the secular knowledge that we have at the time.
Well, in the 70s, we were brought up believing that, because we were told that Christ himself would come into a particular room, into the temple, where he would meet with the prophet, and literally they spoke face to face. And this is why we were to see the prophet as Christ himself, a Christ figurehead, because if it came from his mouth, it was the same as coming from Christ. So there's a reason why this doctrine evolved that way. So it's not figurative in that sense.
No, there was a lot of literal things. There were a lot of things that we were asked to swallow, and that many are still being asked to swallow,
right,
where there has to be a literal belief. And I look at that, and this is what I say to my literal brothers and sisters that look at me as kind of sort of a fallen figure. I look at that and say, if for you need that literal belief, if that's the only way the alchemy will work in you, then I don't have a problem with that. But for you to require me to have that literal belief as well, if this campfire of humanity is only open to people that will worship exactly the way you do and profess, but I know that there are many people that do not literally believe different aspects, and they kind of cherry pick them, but it's an environment where they're not allowed to talk about that, where they're not allowed to say that. It's not safe to say, hey, I know there were no horses in America before Columbus. I know there were no sheep. I know when Christ shows up in the Book of Mormon and says to the people here, other sheep I have which are not of this fold, that if that were true, the people living here would go, what in the world are sheep? We don't know what you're talking about. I know when Christ would give a metaphor that would say, he that would go a mile, I say unto you, go the extra mile. I know that the people living here would go, we don't understand what that means, because that is a Roman law that applies to Jewish people who have to carry Roman citizens' goods for 1 mile, and that you're basically telling them to go the extra mile. That applies specifically to that group. So you're telling us that go 1 mile, go to why are we going any miles? And I also know that if he showed them the holes in his hands and in his side, that to a person living in this part of the world, where crucifixion was not a legal form of capital punishment, they wouldn't understand it. They wouldn't look at that and go, oh, okay, now I know that you're Jesus the Christ, because people who were living here at that time would not make that connection. So I look at all of that and go, okay, it's still a good story. It's still a story that, invites reverence. It's still a story that invites, solemn reflection on covenants that I've made. It's still a story that it's not a bad story. It's just that if you ask me to literally believe that it's true, and if I am honest with you and I tell you I do not literally believe that is true, that I then must be kicked out of this campfire of humanity, that I can no longer break bread with you, that I can no longer, be part of the oaths and covenants that I made. At the end of the day, even though I didn't know I was basically recreating Masonic rituals, I did take an oath and a covenant to help the church grow. And to me, I don't help the church grow by requiring everybody to believe things that are not literally believable. I think the church would actually grow more if we accepted and adopted that there are many people that don't believe, that can't believe, that won't believe, but still want to fellowship, and they still want the alchemy of helping to make good people better and to help make bad people good. But to be told that I can't participate with my family, or I can't participate with my community, the community that has given me so much, that I'm to be kicked out of that just because I have a more literal mind and I see some ridiculous things that are not believable. To me, that's unfortunate. So that's when I talked about figurative Mormon, to me, that's a figurative Mormon. A figurative Mormon is somebody who doesn't literally believe these things, but still sees that there can be good in them. And I would really, really like our religion to join the ranks of the other mature world religions that do not have this stupid litmus test.
There's a lot of coming to the forefront with the truth that they need to do in order for, I think, especially those that have left the religion, to then feel like there was some sort of rectification there and say, okay, now we're starting to get honest. Now I can pick and choose for myself in terms of real free agency. And if I choose that this is the path of alchemy I want to take in order to embody Christ consciousness, then I can do that with all the cards on the table. But right now, I think a lot of individuals realize that they've been lied to, and that's what they focus on. And then that makes that alchemy difficult.
Right. And it's one of the things, too, when you realize that so much of the, it's not just the programming that we get on how to be members. We get a lot of programming on how to be ex-members. We're told to be lazy, offended sinners. We're told to, if you can't leave you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone. Basically, if Mormonism were a kingdom, we throw drawbridges out everywhere and welcome in people that never knew anything about it. And we're very, very hospitable and accommodating to them. Those who used to be members or who used to have literal belief, we throw them over the back wall into the dark forest and pretend that they never existed. And we do not invite them to sit at our tables. We do not embrace them.
Right.
And we pity them and we feel sorry for them. But, one of the biggest things that happens when people start going through these faith crises, they are under the unmistaken belief that the church and the leadership actually wants them to remain in the pews. At the end of the day, the church sees them right now, that they see them as the enemy. They see them as a cancer. They see them as something that must be spit out and expelled.
Yeah.
And so they program, even before somebody reaches a faith crisis, they give you the programming of this is how you should act when you have a faith crisis. And as a result, then people do become hostile, bitter, that they follow the script, not even realizing that even after they've lost their faith, they're still following the script. And by doing that, they're actually reinforcing for those that people are in it. They're looking at that going, well, we were told that this is what would happen when you're under the influence of Satan, that you'd become contentious and dark and the light has gone from your eyes. And now you're doing that. And so obviously this is true.
So I better cut you loose before you drag me down with you.
And again, exactly. And so it is a thought-stopping thought, and it's a script that, again, when I start to have doubts, I'm made to feel bad and ugly and dark. And contention is from the devil. Contention is from the devil. Except when Jesus threw out the moneylenders in the temple, that wasn't from the devil, but contention is from the devil. And if you try and talk with somebody and they start to, I'm feeling very dark and conflicted, it's, well, that's called cognitive dissonance, and that's not from the devil. That's from your wiring. That's the way we're wired. When you presented with a thought, and again, John Dee, look at John Dee. He'd spent his whole life believing something was true, and when faced with, something that was uncomfortable, it was easier for him to keep believing it was true than to just say, wait a minute now, I've spent decades doing this. And when people tell me, oh, your mind is just so closed, it's like, my mind is closed. I've spent decades believing something, and I've assessed it and looked at it and come up with different conclusions. And when an 8-year-old is lauded for making the very adult decision to get baptized, but a 54-year-old man is condemned, because he's acting like a child, because he's actually thinking for himself. To me, there's something wrong with that program.
Right. That's cognitive dissonance. Wow.
Exactly.
Wow. Lots of food for thought. I'm so grateful you came on with me today. We've been trying to put this together for a while, but you are a wealth of information, and literally we could talk for hours about it.
We could. Anytime you want to have me back, just, I'm available.
Absolutely. So what I'll do is I'll put a link in the description box for the Lucy Code, and then will you keep me updated on when your book is going to be published, because I'll get that information out.
Yes, I will. In fact, again, part of what I'm doing is I had lunch with a friend the other day, and so what we want to do is make it very clear: these are facts, and we invite historians to attack those. These are conjectures. This is just my ideas where I'm connecting dots. I've got no proof of this, but the reality is there's lots of people that do things that they don't leave proof.
Right.
If somebody's robbing graves or stealing books, they're not going to go around writing in their journal, "Hey, I'm a book thieving grave robber." So the evidence, just because there's not evidence that something, sometimes all we have is conjecture.
Mm-hmm.
But I look at that again and go, if somebody doesn't literally believe my conjecture, if they don't believe my stories, the whole point of my stories is that you don't have to literally believe stories.
Mm-hmm.
So if they don't believe my stories, but they still find some good in there, some truth in there, I'm okay with that. I don't require people to literally believe what I say. But in return, I ask that I have that same freedom, that I don't have to literally believe what you say, that
Yeah.
I can find truth in that. So
well, I think it's so important that we stay open, that we're allowed to ask questions, and that we're allowed to consider alternate possibilities.
I'm much happier. I'm much happier having, when you look at it and going, having answers that I can't question. I don't like that, but having questions that I don't have answers to,
Mm-hmm.
to me, I actually like that. It's a lot more engaging. It's a lot more freeing. So I'm very, people look at it, they go, well, and I tell you, there was a time I had all the answers. I was going to have my planet.
Uh-huh.
And now I'm beginning to suspect that may not happen. And I look at that and go, dang it. I had, who was going to be on my planet?
Who?
Bigfoot. And now he's, sorry, Kane.
Oh, sorry, Kane.
I had carved out a little corner of my planet for you, but now there's nothing. Sorry.
Oh, wow. Well, you may still have options for Yeti. It may not come in the form of Kane, but, there are all kinds of species possibilities.
It could be.
All right. Well, excellent. Thanks so much. Any parting words for us?
No, just thank you for having me. And again, I appreciate your persistence. I don't know whether, I don't know, how this will be received. But again, if people want to email me or talk to me, I'm more than happy to talk about that.
Well, my work kind of challenges people anyways, because, I don't care if they like me per se. I want them to focus on the material, and the whole objective is to get to truth. And sometimes that doesn't give the warm and fuzzies. That makes us the most uncomfortable, but we still have to look at it.
And for me, the truth that I found is that truth can be found in things that are not literally true. And I'm okay with that.
Yep. Perfect. Well, thanks so much. We'll be in touch, and then I'll get those links below. Thanks for everybody for joining us today. You can reach me at galacticstoryteller@gmail.com. My website is .com. Please like and subscribe. Leave your comments below. As always, be kind, provide resources and facts. We can open up a dialogue, and we will go from there. See you guys in the next video.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.